Hey kids. All right. Today we're going to continue our look at some of the major countries that were involved in World War II. We did Germany and Italy before. Now we're taking a look at kind of two different sorts of countries, that being the Soviet Union, formerly Russia, today Russia once again, and also the nation of Japan. These two countries were definitely kind of different from all of the others, which is why I grouped them together. They really don't have anything in common with each other either, but they definitely just don't fit with some of the others that have kind of something to bind them together in one way or another. So as we take a look at it, we'll see kind of how these countries they kind of started fighting before a lot of the other ones did. We'll see the Japanese invaded China. The war officially started in 1939. The Japanese were fighting in China in 1931. We're going to see a very interesting little war called the Winter War between the Soviet Union and the nation of Finland, which most people don't know very much about. But we see a little tiny country that had a population of about the same thing as the Chicago area, fight off a nation of 200 million people, and they fought them hard enough to where they gave up a little bit of territory, but Finland remained an independent country, unlike a lot of the other countries that kind of got ground up by either the Soviets or the Germans. So let's take a look at it here. Follow along while I read. World War II, between the wars, the Soviet Union and Japan. Mysterious lands. Japan and the Soviet Union, or USSR, were the most difficult to understand on the eve of World War II. Both countries were shrouded in secrecy in the 1920s and 1930s. Japan did not receive much attention in the Western world due to its location in the Eastern Hemisphere, far from the headlines of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union became a paranoid wasteland under the iron rule of Joseph Stalin, who took power in 1924 and maintained it until his death in 1953. Both nations would play a decisive role in World War II. The rising sun. Japan is an island nation that is historically suspicious of outsiders. The Japanese formed friendly relations with the United States in the 1800s, and this continued through World War I. Japan fought on the side of the Allies in the First World War, but was left out of the rewards after the armistice, which all went to the European colonial powers. Resentment over the Versailles Treaty simmered in Japan in the 1920s. The country was an emerging industrial and military power, which would one day compete with the United States and Great Britain for control of the Pacific Ocean. Japan was angered at the continued European colonization of the continent of Asia. Various European countries carved up China, supposedly an independent nation, as if it were a colony. This upset Japan, who favored Asia for the Asians after World War I. Much like in Europe, representative government in Japan did not survive the tough times of the 1920s and 1930s. In the 1930s, the Japanese army took control. Japan was an empire. The emperor was a man named Hirohito and was believed by the Japanese to be a god on earth. He was also a peaceful man and believed in representative government. The tradition of the Japanese emperor, though, was he was not to interfere in day-to-day political issues. When a series of army generals became prime minister, the Japanese parliament or diet became powerless and liberty disappeared in Japan. And there you see the Japanese emperor, a guy who was very misunderstood during World War II. He was thought to be kind of like the Hitler of Japan. He was far from that, but his role, we didn't really understand the way the emperor worked in Japan. He was mostly ceremonial, even though he was the guy who ultimately could decide what the country was going to do. He just didn't. That was the tradition of the Japanese emperor, kind of just a different cultural thing than what we're used to in our part of the world. In 1931, Japan invaded a northern province of China called Manchuria, which contained raw materials such as timber and iron needed to fuel Japan's growing war machine. The Japanese army met virtually no resistance and renamed the area Manchukuo, a Japanese version of the word Manchuria. Supposedly, Manchukuo was a new independent nation under the rule of a former Chinese emperor. The Japanese controlled all affairs, though, as Manchukuo was really a puppet state. And there you can see the Japanese army marching into Manchuria way back in 1931, before anybody thought that there was any reason to be worried about a new world war, much like with Italy invading Ethiopia in 1935 to convince Americans that we were supposed to go to war over what was going on in Manchuria. Most people couldn't find it on a map. They didn't care. We had big troubles in 1931 with the Great Depression. As the 1930s progressed, Japan pushed further and further into China, ending the friendly relations with the USA and Great Britain. The Japanese realized their invasions of China would lead to war with the USA. They also knew they would never win a long war against the Americans. They decided to try and destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and virtually end the war before it could start. The attack was launched on December 7th, 1941, and brought the United States into the war. The specter of the Red Star. Following the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Soviet Union became an international outcast. The democracies of Europe feared the Bolshevik Revolution would spread to their country, and many became viciously anti-communist. Soviet leaders such as Vladimir Lenin actively pushed for the idea of world revolution. To Lenin, it was only a matter of time before other countries followed Russia's lead. The Russian Civil War lasted from 1918 to 1921, and millions of Russians died. Millions more died of starvation in the 1920s and 1930s in famines caused by the war destruction and government farming policies. Lenin's idea of world revolution gradually faded away as Joseph Stalin gained control of the Soviet Union following Lenin's death in 1924. In the 1920s and 1930s, Stalin focused his power on the Soviet Union's own citizens. And there you see Lenin on the left led the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution and during World War I. And then you see Stalin, who took over after Lenin died and led the Soviet Union for the next 25 years or so. Stalin was a murderous, paranoid maniac. He believed there were traitors everywhere in the Soviet Union, whether they actually existed or not. He cemented his control over his country by executing anyone who might disagree with him. The Soviet Union's dreaded secret police, the NKVD, hauled away millions of Soviet citizens in the 1930s for the smallest criticism. Stalin also virtually destroyed the Soviet Red Army. He executed thousands of officers, including 95% of his senior commanders in 1937. Those who were left were either too weak or too scared to disagree with anything Stalin said. The Red Army would pay a fearful price in the early days of World War II because of the poor leadership left over after 1937. In 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact, which basically made them allies. This shocked the world. Hitler was fanatically anti-communist. He jailed or killed most German communists in the mid-1930s. Stalin's supposed reason for executing his officers only 2 years before was they were German agents. The pact had nothing to do with Germany and the Soviet Union actually being friendly, though. Hitler wanted to invade Poland and did not want the Soviets to interfere. Stalin wanted to retake the new Baltic republics of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland, which were all once part of Russia and created by the Versailles Treaty. By signing the non-aggression pact, both dictators got a free hand to conquer territory. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were bullied into signing treaties of friendship with the Soviet Union and then were forcibly added back into the country. Next, Stalin turned his attention to Finland. The Finns had no intention of bowing before Soviet pressure. They possessed a strong little army and were determined to defend their independence. And here you see a guy who had 505 confirmed kills in a 100-day war. So he went to work there in the winter of 1939-1940. In December 1939, the Soviets invaded Finland. Red Army troops outnumbered the Finns everywhere 20-1. In what became known as the Winter War, the tough Finns inflicted huge casualties on the Soviets, driving them back to the Soviet border. The 1937 executions in the frigid weather had a terrible effect on Soviet leadership and morale. 10 Red Army soldiers died for every Finn killed. As tough and fearsome as they were, the Finns knew they could not hold out against the hundreds of thousands of Red Army troops forever. They were counting on Sweden, Britain, France, or perhaps the USA to come to their aid. When it did not happen, the Finns were forced to seek peace terms before they were overwhelmed. Finland gave up some territory to the Soviets, but they preserved their independence. Stalin was shocked by the effect the executions had upon the once mighty Red Army. He knew he needed time to build it back up to a respectable fighting force. Adolf Hitler also saw the poor performance of the Red Army. He came to the mistaken conclusion the Soviets were poor fighters and decided to invade the Soviet Union at some point in the future. So there we see kind of Japan invading China very early in the 1930s, and then the Soviet Union kind of first killing anybody inside the Soviet Union who was mildly critical of the government, and then they sort of turn their attention outward and they bully these countries next to them that were one time part of Russia and became independent after World War I. And three of them, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, went back into the Soviet Union, not willingly, but they were kind of bullied into doing it. And then Finland, who was the fourth one, they decided they were going to fight, and they killed so many Russians in a 4-month period that finally the Russians just said, you know what? Here, we're going to take this little chunk of territory that we've conquered, and you can go ahead and you can stay here. And so it's a good example of standing up to a bully and not allowing them to just kind of run roughshod over the country.